Welcome to Law Talk Today, a series devoted to bringing you informative and educational programs focused on issues of law, government, and community. Hello and welcome to Law Talk Today. I'm Dan Agatino, your host. Joining us in studio today is Dr. Pirelli. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
Can you give us a little bit of information about the kind of practice that you have?
Sure. I'm a forensic psychologist. That means I do psychological evaluations in a wide range of legal matters and cases.
So you were trained as a psychologist and you have legal expertise as well?
Well, there's a couple different ways to go about the training and education. In my particular case, I went to a program that was specifically geared towards forensic psychology, which was at John Jay in the city. And you're trained as a clinical psychologist at your core, but then all of your extra coursework and field experiences are really in the legal field, the correctional environments, and those type of settings.
What does a forensic psychologist do?
Well, again, there's a lot of different opportunities for those in the field. In my particular case, I do, again, psychological evaluations in civil and criminal as well as family matters. So, for example, I'll do evaluations in personal injury cases to determine if the person has experienced a psychological trauma in addition to whatever physical trauma maybe they had. Or workers' compensation, same thing. You might be looking at post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, and so forth. So those are the types of civil types of cases you might take. In the criminal arena, there's competency to stand trial, insanity, violence and sexual risk, in particular cases. And of course, in family court, there's kind of a child abuse and neglect, parental risk and capacity. So there's a whole range if you're like me and you do evaluations. There are also people who do therapy and they work with mandated clients. Let's say sex offenders who are required by the court to engage in 3 months of therapy or these type of things. So you can do therapy or assessment. I particularly focus on assessments.
Do you do assessment for children in family law so that if there's a dispute about custody and the judge says, well, let's see what the kid wants?
Well, definitely forensic psychologists do that. And particularly in a state like New Jersey, there's a lot of that work. I don't actually do custody because I see that as another subspecialty. Mm-hmm. We're in the world of specialties right now. And we all have our limits. And for me, child custody is just a particular niche, which I don't personally get into. But I do see children in other contexts. So I'll see them, again, if there's a question about the parent's risk or the bond, and maybe there's going to be a case where the parental rights might be terminated. In those cases, I might see the child in that context. But again, when it comes to custody or a victim of sexual abuse that needs to do a disclosure or something like that, that really is a particular specialty, and that's not one of mine.
What is your specialty? What is the subspecialty? You're right, we live in an era of specialists. Go to a physician. Usually, it's not anymore that you just even go to a heart doctor. There's plumber cardiologists and electrician cardiologists, and same thing in the law. Most of us have special focus. What's your special focus?
So there's about 10 to 12 areas that I practice in. Obviously competent in all the areas that I practice in, but not necessarily the expert in all of them. The areas I practice in, again, are personal injury, workers' compensation, immigration cases.
Let's stop there. What would an immigration case? Why would you need a forensic psychologist to say,
Sure.
Yes, I'm trying to become a citizen?
Well, not always, but in particular cases, for example, there might be a hardship petition, meaning that a non-citizen, an immigrant, undocumented immigrant, marries a United States citizen. 2 years later, something comes up and that undocumented person is discovered, or maybe they want to legitimize their citizenship, in which case they might call someone like me to evaluate both of them. And the focus is on the citizen. That is to say, if we deport the undocumented person, will there be a psychological hardship to the citizen? So that's called a hardship evaluation. There's also cases they call VAWA, and that's the Violence Against Women Act. And it's not just against women, but that's the act. And that's when there's domestic violence against an undocumented person. Oh. So again, a citizen is being sexually or physically abusive, and the person wants to leave the relationship, but their citizenship, or their immigration status, I should say, is hanging kind of by the rafters. So they want to get out, but they're afraid because they know they'll be deported. So that's called a VAWA petition. And there are others. There's asylum cases where someone might be sex trafficked in a different country, and they escaped. And they came here just for asylum. And you might do an evaluation to see and ultimately say to the judge, look, sending them back there, is really dangerous for them for these types of reasons. Again, in my case, psychologically, I'm speaking to trauma, typically depression, anxiety, these types of issues.
What about when you have to speak to a judge to say the opposite of, I have been paid as a professional to evaluate this person, and your evaluation does not comport with what their wishes were. So somebody comes to you and they're looking for X, but you have a code of ethics.
Absolutely. It can be tense at times. Obviously everybody's involved in the legal process, but they have different objectives and goals, right? So a defense attorney is tasked with defending their client and being the advocate for their client. The judge hopefully is there to be the objective, essentially referee and ultimate decision maker. When I'm called in as an expert, my main goal is to be objective, inform the trier of fact, whether it's a judge or a jury in a particular case. So there are many times where I won't give an opinion that the attorney who retained me is in favor of or wants. Now, it depends on the case, it depends on the area of work. So in a lot of civil matters, there's a attorney work product that is protected, in which case after I do my evaluation, I speak with the attorney and he says, well, I don't agree with your opinions, don't write in a report.
And that's it.
Go away. And then, if the case allows it, then I go away, and it may never, come to be in terms of a report or testimony. In other cases, that may not be possible. In certain other commitment cases or, again, criminal cases, once it becomes discoverable, right, once the court and the opposing attorney understands that I've been retained and so forth, then there may not be that possibility. And at the end of the day, I'm there, to be an advocate for my opinion, not for somebody's client. That's their job, and it can get challenging.
What about your opinion? Because as a practicing attorney, I could tell you that there are cases that come down to a battle of the experts. And it could be physicians, it could be psychologists, it could be others, where you are trained as a forensic psychologist, and the other side may have a psychologist with similar training and background, and you say black and they say white. Tell us about that.
Well, it can happen, and it often does happen, because a lot of times the legal strategy fosters that. In other words, one side retains me, and then the other side might subsequently retain an expert to refute. So I'll get reports back, or I'll see reports at a later point from a psychiatrist or a psychologist that essentially might be kind of critiquing, to be nice about it, my report and so forth. So a lot of times,
soft. It's not just critiquing, right? Isn't it? They say this.
They're bashing it.
They're bashing it.
They're bashing it.
And then you have to come out and.
Well, it's challenging because I hate to see that, because then you look at it and you say, well, that's not really an independent evaluation. Mm-hmm. You're using the information that I've set forth, and you're essentially just, refuting X, Y, or Z. But it's part of the legal process, and we're in an adversarial system. So for experts who want to be a part of it and who want to be objective, we have to understand that there's that line between being part of an adversarial system where there's some gamesmanship. We don't obviously want to participate in that, but we also want to be useful, okay, to the trier of fact. So what I like to do to get around that is, certainly my opinions are never for sale, okay, I'm not a hired gun as they call it, but what I like to do is build trust and a relationship with the attorneys I work with, so that oftentimes they'll trust my opinion about a mental health issue. They're the legal experts, but I'm the mental health expert. So the attorneys that I've built good relationships, instead of going doctor shopping and going to the next doctor that will say what they want to hear, a lot of times they might modify their legal strategy because they say, okay, well, I trust Dr. Pirelli, I trust his opinion in this area, maybe we need to look at the case slightly differently. And for me, those are the most rewarding opportunities because then I really feel like it is, I'm being part of the process in an objective way and so forth. Of course, there are times where I've gotten calls from attorneys and they say, can you please cut out page 3 and 7 and this and that? And again, that becomes really challenging because now you're in a position where how far can you truly modify your opinions and maintain objectivity?
Well, let's talk about that. So that if there is a case that you're involved with and you submit which I know personally to be very thorough evaluations, and there are questions on the other side, they say, you know what, this is great, except this, and this.
Right.
Delete.
Right. and it certainly has happened. I've been confronted with that. And what I always tell attorneys is this. Look, I'm happy to collaborate to an extent. Well, to this extent. You may read the report that I sent, but please just check for factual inaccuracies. Because I'm a human being,
right,
certainly. And if I said that it happened in February in 2012 and I was incorrect, and you can catch that and it actually happened in April, well, then I'd like to modify that because that's a factual inaccuracy that I want to correct. But anything that's connected to my opinion and my ultimate opinions about the case and conclusions, I will not modify or remove because that's how I form my opinion. And I take a lot of pride in my opinions. My career is based on it. I've spent a long time, training, and I really will not modify based on other people's thoughts. The way I approach my cases, I do the thorough evaluation, as you said, and then I write a report. And truthfully, almost invariably, I don't know what my opinions are going to be until the end. In fact, what I'll often do is I'll write the whole report.
Right.
I'll proofread it, and then I'll come back the next day. I'll literally, unless there's a push that I need to get it done, I'll literally sleep on it, go back, read it again, and then really, truly put the conclusion section together. I like to have a fresh set of eyes, and I've never released a report without having a peer or colleague that I've worked with or I consult with, look at it. You have to always be thinking that this is going to go to trial, and I take that very seriously. These are high-stakes cases.
What about the actual evaluation process itself? You said you've been through an enormous amount of training. You had the core psychological training and then the specialized training, and then, of course, you've honed because of your practice. For people who are interested, ask me a few evaluation questions that are standard.
Well,
what would it be like? What do you inquire about? What questions do you ask of a personal injury, someone who suffered from a personal injury, someone who you're trying to evaluate? Do they have PTSD? Are they depressed? Is there a concern that the relationship they're in is abusive?
Sure.
What are some of the standard questions?
Let me preface it by saying this. This is the difference between a psychologist who's in a therapeutic role, therapy and so forth, and a forensic evaluator. And a lot of times attorneys will ask me, well, what's the difference? Can I just get the psychologist who they're working with to write a report? And this is, what you're asking is really what distinguishes it. When I'm doing an evaluation of someone, I need to know what the referral questions are. What is the legal question at hand? So in a personal injury case, the question is, did this event or events because sometimes it's not just a car accident or a sexual abuse incident. Sometimes they've been harassed for 2 years at their workplace. So it can be an event or a series of events. But either way, is that the proximate cause, that's the legal language, to the depression or to the anxiety disorder or so forth? So I need to be able to ascertain, first of all, do they have a mental health issue? That's the first part.
Okay.
Which most clinical psychologists can. But where the forensic piece comes in, how does that link to the legal question? And that's the key. So to answer your question directly, I would start with the quote-unquote usual suspect types of background questions. What is your, where you're from? How was your upbringing? What was your education level? Substance use history, medical history, mental health history. These are what we call mental status exam type of questions, general background questions. And oftentimes it's relevant in most cases because you're trying to establish where the person was before the incident or before whatever the question is. Okay?
But you use the legal term proximate cause.
Right.
And so I'm just thinking as an attorney
Yes.
that if I didn't like what you had, if you were on the other side,
Right.
that there's so many, especially with the issues of proximate cause. For example, let's say driving here today to the studio, there was a detour. I had no choice but to go down the side road, and it started to rain. And shame on me, I'm going 36 miles an hour
Right.
in a 35 mile an hour zone.
Right.
And as I'm passing on this road that I didn't want to take, I was forced to take it. And unfortunately, force majeure, the nature, it's raining. I pass by a house where there's a rotted tree in the front yard that comes crashing down. Now, the owner of the house knew that it was a rotted tree.
Sure.
And so that owner had an obligation. I knew I should be going 35 instead of 36, and I had an obligation. I was detoured. It wasn't really anybody's fault that there was a rainstorm and that there was a detour. The proximate cause of this accident, it's sophisticated. Maybe it was 25% my fault and 30% the person who knew they had a rotted tree,
Sure.
and we could blame nature for 45%. And how do you say, you have a problem and you have a problem because of this injury?
Well, it is very complicated, and that's why those particular cases take many, many hours.
I see.
And so in a personal injury case, for example, I employ what's called a day before model. So in other words, what was the person's functioning the day before or the minute before the incident? So you're literally going through their thorough history and functioning up until the incident occurred, okay? So you kind of isolate that time period. Then you're looking at their functioning at the time of the incident, okay? And then you're looking essentially at their functioning after that. They're retrospective assessments, so they're always limited in that way. You have to be looking backwards, and you have to be looking at their history and so forth. But as a mental health expert, you're able to understand trajectories. In other words, someone doesn't wake up at the age of 45 and become psychotic. Someone doesn't all of a sudden develop complex post-traumatic stress disorder for no reason, okay? So yes, the actual cause is a different question, and there might be limitations. I'm not trying to say that every evaluation I do, I can say, well, that caused that and that. People are very complex. I tell my students when I teach as well that when we're talking about cause, it's a very complex issue in and of itself. One day we hear that a certain food is good for you. One day we hear it's not, it's bad for you. This changes. And that's because a lot of times we can talk about correlations or relationships between things, but we can't necessarily speak in terms of cause. So what we try to do in these assessments is to essentially develop the chain, okay? How is the person functioning along this chain? And then when this happened, how did that change? So in terms of conducting the evaluation, you're doing an interview, but that's just one piece of it. You're doing extensive records review. You're evaluating, you're interviewing what we call collateral interviews. Friends, family, people that know them, who can speak about how they were before and after. You're doing psychological testing. Now, this is another kind of forensic issue. When you go to a therapist's office, and you start talking about your problems, in order to build rapport and have empathy, they have to assume you're telling them the truth. When you're doing a forensic evaluation, it's the opposite.
You assume they're lying.
Well, Not that necessarily they're lying, but you have to assume that there is a potential for secondary gain, okay? And that is, if this is a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, they might exaggerate. Someone might reasonably exaggerate. Or if they're facing 30 years in prison, I don't know. If you were facing 30 years in prison, you might omit something, right? We go to our medical doctors and they say, when's the last time you smoked? It's been a year.
Yeah.
We lie for no reason on a daily basis. And that's called impression management, right? We do this on job interviews and so forth. We can call it lying, but a lot of times it's just trying to look better or worse. Sometimes it's very adaptive, right? But in forensic cases, we don't assume that everyone's lying. We just assume that they have potential motivation to respond one way or another. So you don't want to look at it, we're trying to determine if they lie or not. I'm not a lie detector. We're looking at response style. And is it matching up with the records? Is it matching up with the testing? So we do testing that actually looks at that. The type of responding that they're engaging in. Are they someone that's consistent? And there's tests that do that. There's 300 item tests they'll take. It'll look at consistency in responding or rare, infrequent events. So
what are some of the questions on the 300
Right. So some of them are just very simple. I think my friends are always there for me types of questions, and you're trying to look at different personality styles. And some are more specific to clinical issues. I've been experiencing many headaches recently and so forth. That's one type of testing. That's called self-report testing. There's other types of testing people do, like you might have heard of the Rorschach ink blot test.
Is that still used?
What is this? People use it. People
do
definitely
you in your
use
practice?
I don't. And there's a whole debate in the field. Should you use it? Should you not? Is it admissible in court? Is it not? Look, I have over 30 tests in my testing closet. I look at them as tools. I literally look at it as if you're a plumber and you bring your toolbox.
So it was Maslow who said, if the only tool you have is a hammer, you see all problems as a nail. And you're saying that you have a hammer and a screwdriver and a wrench and a...
I think you have to. I have the Rorschach in my testing closet, but I haven't felt the need to use it in one of my more recent cases. I've used it many times in the past. I was trained on it and so forth. If a particular case warranted it, it's right there for me to use. I don't lead with it because I work from a referral-based standpoint.
You and I know what it is, but maybe our viewers don't. So can you tell me, you're looking at what essentially appears to me, a layperson, as a blotch of ink.
Right.
And then someone's imagination comes into play as, what is it that you see? Almost like looking up at the clouds and saying,
sure.
I see a monkey driving a golf cart.
The premise is this, and again, there's different types of psychological testing approaches. So one is, as I said, self-reports, where you're relying on the person to report exactly, how they feel about a certain question or an item. This is intended to give you an ambiguous stimuli, right? Something that just by looking at it could mean or look like many different things to different people. Mm-hmm. So the idea is by showing these people numerous cards that are ambiguous, you'll get a sense as to how they see the world, okay? Now, some people think that it will look in the deep recesses of your mind and so forth. That's probably quite inaccurate. It's really more of like a perceptual test.
You looked skeptical about that.
It's more of a perceptual test in the sense that, not perceptual, how is your vision, perceptual, how you see the world, right? So we deal with ambiguous stimuli all day, right? You use the clouds as an example, but there's conversations that we enter into, there's things that we confront on a daily basis that we have to make sense of that aren't clear cut, right? The world isn't handed to us on a platter all the time. So when you get to see how someone responds and kind of creates their world, it does have utility. Now, that's the main key for me is what is the utility in this particular case? So I said I don't use that particular measure in my legal cases. Look, in a different environment with different types of cases, I might use it every day, But in my particular cases, oftentimes, at least to this point, it hasn't given me the utility above and beyond the other tools and tests that I have to answer the questions that are posed, right? So it's not a fishing expedition. You have to really, look, you want to take someone's blood pressure, you go get the cuff and you take their blood pressure.
A sphygmomanometer.
There you go.
We only have a few minutes left, and I want to ask you two final questions.
Sure.
One is, if there is somebody who's interested in going into your field, what suggestion do you have for them?
So there's a lot of different programs popping up. This is actually a new field. People have been doing it for 50 years, but it's actually kind of new in terms of formal training. So I would direct people to what's called the American Psychology Law Society, which is Division 41 of the American Psychological Association. So the website is ap-ls.org, or you can just Google American Psychological Association and find Division 41, and that's going to have unbelievable amount of resources with respect to training and education and so forth. So that'll answer all your questions for those starting out.
And then my final question is, for those who are watching and wanted to get in contact with you, can you give us your contact information?
Absolutely, yeah. You can Google me, first of all, but also my website is Pirelli. That's GPIRELLI.com. It's my first initial, my last name. My phone number's on there, my email. I get all kinds of correspondence. Obviously, I'm happy to do legal cases for people, as well as general psychological testing. Sometimes people contact me for therapy. I help them find the right person to go to. Or sometimes people just want to ask general questions about training and education. So I'm happy to communicate with people from the public and all different spheres.
And if someone wanted to contact you to either give a presentation or to share some of your expertise at their local bar association or whatever their group is, you do that kind of work?
I do a lot of presentations and seminars. I take a lot of pride in that because I really feel like I can give back in that way. A lot of times, again, you're involved in the legal arena, as you well know. Sometimes you could feel like your opinions don't necessarily get, to where you want them to be. But I love to give back to the community when I can.
Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Law Talk Today. I'm Dan Agatino, your host.